This hearing will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Good morning and welcome to the Research and Technology Subcommittee's first hearing of the 116th Congress. A warm welcome to our distinguished group of witnesses. We have a great panel this morning, and I'm looking forward to hearing your testimony. As a Michigan native, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Eric Haig, who joins us from Michigan State University. Congrats on Saturday's win, and thank you for being here with us. I'm sorry I'm not wearing my green. As a member of this committee, we have the opportunity to learn about critical, new, and emerging technologies with the capacity to benefit society in a number of ways, and to consider how the federal government can best support the responsible development of these technologies. This morning, the committee will discuss new and developing biotechnologies enabled by engineering biology research and their potential applications in sustainable agriculture, advanced manufacturing, and bioenergy. Engineering biology, a term which is used interchangeably with synthetic biology, is a multidisciplinary field at the intersection of biological, physical, chemical, and information sciences, and engineering that allows researchers to re-engineer and develop new biological systems. While human gene editing is a hot topic of discussion in the public sphere, most of engineering biology research being done today, even the human health research, is on microorganisms and plants. Engineering biology, in addition to enabling whole new industries, may yield significant environmental and health benefits because of its potential to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, improve food security and agricultural land use, make manufacturing processes much cleaner, combat antibiotic resistance, and even clean up legacy toxic waste sites. Today, we will hear from experts in academia and industry about the nature of engineering biology research, the current size of the commercial market, and the potential for growth, how the U.S. stacks up against our foreign competitors, and the state of the U.S. biotechnology workforce. We will also hear from scholars on the ethical and security implications of engineering biology. It is essential that as we look to grow the U.S. investment in engineering biology R&D, we integrate the oversight framework necessary to protect the public and the environment and to guard against national security risks. In this committee, it is easy to get excited about the potential for new technologies, but we need only to look at the unintended consequences of past technologies to understand that we also must take a look at the risks. Given the tremendous economic potential buttressed with the potential risks for engineering biology R&D, we seek to maintain U.S. leadership in this area of research and technological development. We seek to develop and charter a national strategy, as we currently do not have one. In the meantime, where other countries, including China, are well ahead of us in establishing engineering biology as a national priority and providing the necessary funding and political will to realize these goals. In this hearing, we will specifically consider the merits of the Engineering Biology Research and Development Act introduced last Congress by the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. Johnson. The bill would provide a framework for a strategic and coordinated federal program in engineering biology R&D. It is long overdue that we take this legislation up in committee. I am sure today's hearing will give us some good feedback on how to improve this legislation so it helps to ensure U.S. leadership in engineering biology R&D. I look forward to the expert testimony and to the discussion. And with that, I yield back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Baird for an opening statement.
Thank you, and good morning, and thank you, Chairwoman Stevens. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and for holding this hearing. I'm looking forward to working with you on the Research and Technology Subcommittee as the ranking member. I'm also glad that engineering biology and the bioeconomy is the subject of our first subcommittee hearing of the year. In my central Indiana district, the emerging bioeconomy presents an opportunity to expand and enable new markets in agriculture, energy, and manufacturing. From the basic research that's conducted at Purdue University to the development and application of that research by the more than 1,700 biology science businesses in the state, Indiana is on the forefront of the biotechnology innovation. Humans have used biotechnology since the dawn of civilization, manipulating biology to improve plants and animals through hybridization and other methods. Since my days in the lab working towards my PhD on monogastric nutrition, there have been rapid advancements in scientific knowledge and technology that have given rise to the field of modern biotechnology, making useful products to meet human needs and human demands. We have a distinguished panel of witnesses today who will help us understand the state of science in engineering biology and advise us on how to maintain U.S. leadership in biology innovation. I particularly want to thank our witness, Dr. Kevin Solomon from Purdue University, my alma mater, for being here today. I'm very interested to learn more about the cutting-edge research on engineering biology in the gut microbiome of cattle and other livestock. I hope that today's hearing will help inform research and regulatory framework that continues to ensure safe and ethical development of biotechnology without stifling innovation. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Braard. He's correct. I, too, am looking forward to working with him on the subcommittee for research and technology. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Lucas, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stevens and Ranking Member Baird, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to our witnesses. In both the House Agriculture Committee and the Science Committee, we've held hearings on biotechnology research and regulation for years, but I can't remember a more exciting or challenging time for the field than today. New gene editing techniques like CRISPR and the advancement of rapid genetic sequencing are driving innovations in agriculture, medicine, energy, and manufacturing. Since we first began cultivating crops and breeding livestock, humans have been trying to improve plant and animal genetics. Now we're developing the tools to do it with a precision, speed, and scale our ancestors could not have imagined. In the Capitol, there is a statue of Dr. Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution. Dr. Borlaug developed new crop strains that saved billions from famine and helped develop the abundant and affordable food supplies we enjoy today. His work set the stage for modern biotechnology, which took off in 1973 when American scientists developed a technique that allowed the production of genetically engineered human insulin. It was the first biotech product approved for sale in the United States in 1982 and has improved the lives of millions of diabetics. In addition to these improvements in agriculture and medicine, engineering biology could also transform the energy sector. Scientists are engineering biology to try to address energy challenges such as enhanced oil recovery, environmental remediation, carbon sequestration, and new materials. Several of our panelists are working in this area, and I look forward to hearing more about their work. The U.S. was a key driver of biological innovation in the 20th century, but there is increasing global competition. Other countries recognize the benefits of biotechnology and are striving to capture its potential through new investments and friendly regulations. We must keep pace and set a research and regulatory framework that supports innovation, creates a marketplace for new ideas and products while setting the safety and ethical standards for the world to follow. I look forward to working with Chairwoman Johnson to advance legislation that will promote a national research strategy around engineering biology to ensure the U.S. remains the global leader in biotechnology. I hope this hearing will help inform us about our work on legislation and our work in the future. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, I would like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness, Dr. Rob Carlson, is the managing director of Bioeconomy Capital, a venture capital firm that invests in industrial biotechnology. He is the author of Biology is Technology, the Promise, Peril, and New Business of Engineering Life. Dr. Carlson holds a bachelor's degree in physics from the University of Washington and a PhD in physics from Princeton. Our next witness is Dr. Kevin Solomon. Dr. Solomon is an assistant professor of agricultural and biological engineering at Purdue University. His work focuses on the development of sustainable microbial processes to supply the energy, materials, and medicines of tomorrow. He holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and bioengineering from McMaster University in Canada and a PhD in chemical engineering from MIT. Our third witness, Dr. Eric Hegg, is a professor of biochemistry and molecular biology at Michigan State University and is also the Michigan State University subcontract lead at the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, a Department of Energy funded research center working to develop sustainable biofuels and bioproducts. Dr. Haig holds a bachelor's degree from Kalamazoo College and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. After Dr. Haig is Dr. Shaun Simpson. Dr. Simpson is the Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of LanzaTech, a biotechnology company that converts waste carbon from industrial processes into commodity chemicals and biofuels. Dr. Simpson received his master's in science from Nottingham University and his PhD from the University of York in the United Kingdom. Our final witness is Dr. Laurie Zoloth. Dr. Zoloth is the Margaret E. Burton Professor of Religion and Ethics, as well as a senior advisor to the Provost for programs in social ethics at the University of Chicago. Dr. Zoloth was previously the president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. She holds a bachelor's degree in women's studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and received a master's in Jewish studies and a doctorate in social ethics from the Graduate Theological Union. Great. Well, the chair at this time would like to recognize our chairwoman, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you. I apologize for being late. Let me give a quick statement. First, let me welcome all of our witnesses and thank the chairwoman and ranking member for holding this hearing. Today, we will hear about engineering biology research, you can tell I'm out of breath, and its applications in energy, agriculture, manufacturing, the environment, and human health. We've invited academic researchers, a small company, as well as experts on ethics and security implications of engineering biology to help us understand how we can maintain U.S. leadership in engineering biology and achieve a sustainable bioeconomy. Engineering biology research allows researchers to safely re-engineer existing biological systems and to learn from and mimic existing biological systems to perform novel tasks and develop novel materials and products. Technologies enabled by engineering biology are exciting and have the potential to solve some of society's greatest challenges, including providing food for a growing population, reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, and dramatically transforming manufacturing. They also have numerous implications for human health as well as for the environment. Because of the great promise of this research and its applications, I introduced the Engineering Biology Research and Development Act in 2015. By then, several other countries had already prioritized engineering biology and developed national strategies for their investments. And I was concerned that the U.S. risked losing our leadership in an industry we historically dominated. Here we are, 4 years later, and instead of pulling together the expert stakeholders to develop such a strategy, this current administration is prompting massive cuts to our science budgets once again. There's no question that we would cede our leadership in engineering biology, as well as in many other areas of science and technology, if the President's proposed cuts to this nation's R&D enterprise were to be enacted into law. I intend for this committee to set us on a more hopeful path forward, and I hope we can work on a bipartisan basis to ensure that the whole Congress does likewise. The Engineering Biology Research and Development Act would establish a framework for greater interagency coordination of federal investments in engineering biology and lead to a national strategy for these investments. The bill would also focus on expanding public-private partnerships and on education and training for the next generation of engineering biology researchers. Importantly, the bill would ensure that we address any potential ethical, legal, environmental, and societal issues associated with engineering biology. It will also ensure that public engagement and outreach are an integral part of this research initiative. The committee was not given the opportunity to consider and move this bipartisan piece of legislation since 2015. However, it is on our agenda this year, and I look forward to working with my colleagues and on both sides of the aisle so we consider amendments informed by experts and including on today's panel. A sustainable bioeconomy is central to the future of U.S. competitiveness and the well-being of our population. And engineering our way to a sustainable bioeconomy begins with a national strategy and careful attention to societal implications. I once again thank all of our witnesses for being here, and I look forward to the discussion, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman of our full committee. If there are any members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. As our witnesses should know, you each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you all have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. We will start with Dr. Carlson.
Well, thank you first for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity to address the committee and to share what I've learned over the years about the size of the bioeconomy and how it's changing. My name is Rob Carlson, and I am the managing director at Bioeconomy Capital in Seattle. We also have offices in San Francisco. I'm also a principal at a consulting firm called Biodesic, which focuses on engineering, strategy, and security. And I've just recently rejoined the faculty in an affiliate position with the Paul Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. But I'm here on behalf of myself and Bioeconomy Capital today. And I was asked to share a few slides about what I've discovered about the size of the bioeconomy. And it's not small. About 2007 or so, I was in Hong Kong on a consulting trip discussing biofuels and biomaterials, talking to big banks about investment. And it occurred to me that maybe I should know how big it was. What was this thing I was talking about? What was the bioeconomy? And so I was taking a break in the middle of a thunderstorm in my hotel in Hong Kong and looking out over the bay, and with a metaphorical and literal flash of lightning, I realized nobody knew how big it was. I Googled the size of it, and there was no data. And there ensued about 10 years' worth of effort to try to put some numbers on this, and I finally published those in 2016 in Nature Biotech. And these numbers are updated as of this week to 2017. There's no U.S. government record-keeping, statistical record-keeping of this information. This is all sort of by hook and crook. Wherever I can find data, I put it together and include it in the publications, and then in the accounting that you see before you. So biologics are about $137 billion of revenue in the United States. Those are drugs that are mostly proteins, but also now increasingly some other compounds. Genetically modified crops and seeds are, in 2017, about $104 billion. That goes up and down, of course, because crop prices go up and down. The penetration of genetically modified crops in each of the markets that they're in is nearly 100%, between 90 and 100. Varies a little bit every year. The big number that surprised me when I first started doing this and continues to surprise is the industrial biotech sector, which people don't usually discuss. That's enzymes and materials. And overall, I think it's worth noting here that the worldwide semiconductor revenues in 2016 were $370 billion. So all of this biotech, just in the United States, is bigger than the global semiconductor industry. The breakdown of those industrial biotech numbers are interesting to me. The biochemicals portion of that is about $92 billion. That's business to business. So the consumer level impact is certainly more than $100 billion. Biofuels in the US contribute only about $4 billion. So this is kind of an unheralded section of the economy that we don't really understand. This is now almost certainly in the US government supply chain, certainly in the Defense Department supply chain, and there's no way to track it. There's no way to know how big it is. There's no way to know who's making what or how many people are employed in this industry, other than what private companies choose to share about that. And I think this is a serious oversight in the way we're understanding our economy. Not that we should be managing it aggressively, but we should certainly be understanding it. Those revenues have grown quite significantly over the years. You can see the breakdown here. The bars are data that I've been able to grab from various sources over the years, and the industrial data, I should say, is provided by Agilent the last few years. They're the only company that's publicly acknowledging a wide marketing study, but it's a marketing study. It's not based on government statistics in the way that you would draw on the NAICS, the North American Industrial Classification System, which is how we understand the rest of our economy. And then the growth rates there are shown. All of this is, of course, in my testimony, and I won't spend a lot of time on it here, but I'm happy to answer questions about it as we go forward. Once you have that data, then you can start comparing the growth in biotech to the rest of the economy, and it is non-trivial, right? So now we're up at about 2% of GDP from biotechnology. This is from engineered biological systems. That's bigger than mining. It's bigger than several construction industries. It's bigger than some manufacturing industry subsectors in the United States. And it's quite intriguing there on that top line to see how much of US GDP growth was contributed by biotechnology in the recent recession. It's a more stable industry than many, and again, I think we should be understanding this better. And finally, I'll just close on some observations that originally were drawn from a biodefense net assessment that I wrote several years ago, trying to understand who was doing what in the world. And as we've heard from the opening statements, many countries are investing very heavily. China in particular is leading out with serious investment, and also potentially with, maybe I have one more slide. Nope. We can discuss China in the questions. I've just closed here by saying the definition of bioeconomy and what we include in our definition clearly is going to be different from other countries. Last spring at the Global Bioeconomy Summit, the final communique said, here's what we think the bioeconomy is, but really you can define it however you like. And that's not super useful for comparing across countries. And we should, I think, have a definition that's consistent over time. And then we can use that also to judge other countries. So at the moment, we can't know whether we're winning or losing because we're not measuring anything. But it's clear that other countries are investing very heavily and are making some progress. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Dr. Solomon.
Chairwoman Stevens, Ranking Member Baird, and members of the committee. Good morning. My name is Kevin Solomon, and I am an assistant professor of agricultural and biological engineering at Purdue University. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today about my work at the intersection of engineering, synthetic biology, and the microbiome. My lab develops microbial systems that have diverse applications for agriculture, bioenergy, and biomanufacturing. Our work is currently supported by the National Science Foundation, and we rely on the user facilities provided by the Department of Energy's Office of Science. One specific example I would like to share from my work that showcases the potential of engineering biology has to deal with our work studying the microbiomes, the gut microbiomes of cattle and other livestock. These tiny microbes that live within these animals, they are critical for digestion and providing nutrition to the host animal. However, their ability to degrade this plant material to provide this nutrition also has an ability to revolutionize bioenergy production. At the same time, these microbes, they produce antibiotic-like compounds that we believe may be harnessed into new medicines in the future. And my lab is very much interested in understanding, controlling, and imitating these microbes because they have the potential to naturally enhance food production in cattle and other livestock, to overcome a key hurdle in bioenergy, and potentially provide us with new tools to combat antibiotic resistance. So based on this example, we can see that engineering biology research can simultaneously affect multiple domains and multiple mission areas within the federal government. And so the Coordinated Federal Research Program for Engineering Biology, as envisioned by the Engineering Biology and Research and Development Act of 2019, will enable the U.S. to continue its leadership in engineering biology. In my written testimony, I elaborate more on the state of research and training in this area and outline how the bill may advance these areas. However, I'd like to provide a brief overview of 4 key goals that I think the bill should address. First, the bill should provide a forum for interagency collaboration and information sharing, as well as multi-agency funding mechanisms that enable game-changing technologies. The current funding mission is very mission-driven and relies on the ability of scientists to correctly match agency needs to their science, regardless of innovation. A coordinated framework can help remove these artificial institutional barriers to innovation, help us better recognize and support innovative and cross-cutting ideas that will be key to maintaining the preeminence of American technology. And hopefully these mechanisms should consider these ideas for funding from all relevant agencies. Second, we should provide sustained research funding to critical research programs in engineering biology at mission agencies. So many federal agencies currently benefit from engineering biology, and agencies such as the Department of Energy, NASA, they have selected topics of interest that they rotate in a 4-year cycle. However, these topics may, because they're not coordinated currently, they may overlap in a given year, which leads to lapses in funding in subsequent years. And what that does is that those gaps in funding, they discourage and slow the development of emerging leaders with innovative ideas. And that can cause the U.S. to fall behind, to follow rather than lead in these critical areas. And so a coordinated framework can help provide a more sustained commitment to research. Third, we should ensure a variety of funding mechanisms to ensure a broad ecosystem of researchers along with focused multidisciplinary centers. Major center opportunities are an important component of the engineering biology ecosystem as they act as nexuses for student training, interdisciplinary research, and commercialization of technology. As a graduate of one of these, I am an advocate for them. However, it's also important that individual researchers have the opportunity to contribute to ensure a broad and healthy ecosystem of research. And finally, we should also increase U.S. capacity and the number of people with skills in engineering biology by providing direct support for experiential training programs. Currently, student research is essential to preparing the emerging engineering biology workforce and train researchers of the future. For example, within this community, we have developed and we have embraced the International Genetically Engineered Machines Competition, or IGEM, which has trained more than 40,000 students from across the globe. And these students are high school students, undergraduate, and also graduate students. Their combined efforts have led to a number of startups, some of them in excess of, with excessive evaluation of $1 billion. These student-led teams, they engage in authentic research to solve societal problems, develop critical skills in leadership, communication, and entrepreneurship, and they learn key values such as biosecurity, safety, and ethics. Funding mechanisms for teams that participate in these programs would be very helpful to sustain these efforts. In closing, a coordinated initiative in engineering biology will greatly enhance American competitiveness and innovation. And I just want to thank you again, the committee here, for your work on this important issue and for supporting our community. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Dr. Haig.
It is my honor to testify today on the opportunities of new and emerging technologies associated with engineering biology. I'm representing myself and the views I express on my own. By way of background, I'm biochemistry professor at Michigan State University. And in this role, I have experienced the critical collaborative partnerships that exist between the federal government and universities. At MSU, DOE and NSF funding make up approximately 50% of the total federal research budget. These funds support vital cutting-edge research, train future scientific leaders, and develop new economic sectors. My research focuses on understanding how nature uses metals to perform difficult transformations. Obtaining a deeper understanding of nature's strategies may enable us to produce better catalytic systems for industrial processes. In each of my research projects, there are clear potential applications in bioenergy, environmental research, or human health. It is imperative to remember that in basic research, discoveries made in one field can provide profound and unexpected benefits in other areas. It is therefore nearly impossible to overestimate or predict its full impact on the economy or quality of life. In addition to my personal research, I also serve as the MSU Subcontract lead for the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, which is administered by the University of Wisconsin. The GLBRC's mission is to perform the basic research needed to enable an economically viable and environmentally sustainable biofuel industry. Success in this area has the potential to boost future U.S. energy security, lower greenhouse gas emissions, and create jobs in rural America. To accomplish this mission, the GLBRC performs a broad range of research, including engineering improved bioenergy crops, engineering microbes to convert biomass into biofuels, and optimizing field-to-product integration that is crucial to the biofuels industry. Essentially, all GLBRC research focuses on potential applications, and a large fraction of our research relates to engineering biology, whereby we harness the power of nature to improve plants and microbes. GLBRC research and technology has led to over 100 licenses and options, highlighting the industrial relevance of this work and its impact on the economy. When performing this research, ethical considerations are always critical to our decision-making process. For example, to avoid competing with food production, we focus on dedicated bioenergy crops grown on lands not currently used for farming. Similarly, we give significant consideration to the plants and microbes we engineer, especially those that might get deployed or released into the environment. Key questions we consider include the possibility of engineered plants and microbes outcompeting native species, and the likelihood and potential ramifications of genes inadvertently being transferred to other organisms. Teaching and outreach is a critical mission at land-grant institutions such as MSU. This includes ensuring that students and the community are educated about the important ethical considerations of our research. When discussing genetic engineering in the classroom or to the public, my goal is to provide information that enable people to make informed decisions about the risks versus the benefits. Interest in the biological sciences at MSU has grown steadily, and students are eager to gain real-world experiences. Their interest in hands-on research can be seen in the large number of applications to summer undergraduate research programs. Competition for these programs is intense, and typically there are far more qualified applicants than there is funding. Additional federal funding would significantly strengthen these programs. Meaningful research experiences teach critical thinking, encourage creativity, and provide vital skills, thereby significantly impacting the size and quality of the future workforce. The proposed Engineering Biology Act would enhance the country's competitive advantage by increasing support for research and education, and accelerating commercialization. Engineering biology is likely to grow in global economic importance, and increased interagency coordination can help ensure U.S. leadership. The coordination proposed in this bill will be especially powerful as this subcommittee works closely with other authorizing committees and agencies that fund engineering biology research, including the NIH, DoD, and USDA. It is imperative, however, that any new initiatives be supported with a commensurate level of new funding. In times of tight fiscal budgets, it is essential that both investigator-initiated and center-level efforts be encouraged. Thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Dr. Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee. My name is Shaun Simpson. I am the Chief Scientific Officer and founder of a startup biotech company called LanzaTech. we have developed and now commercialized a process that allows the conversion of wastes and residues into both biofuels and chemicals. Our process allows emissions from industry, wastes from society, and waste from agriculture to all equally be used in the production of fuels that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase local energy security. The process is biologically based. We have developed organisms that use gases, carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide, as the source of carbon and energy for fuel and chemical synthesis. This allows us to place a conversion facility at a steel mill and convert the wastes inevitably produced as a function of steel manufacture into a low-carbon fuel that displaces gasoline. We have commercialized our process and now operate a facility in China where a waste stream from a steel mill is used to produce over 46,000 tons annually of fuel ethanol that enters the local market as a fuel additive. We currently have a number of commercial prospects. We are commercializing our process here in the US, in California, using agricultural waste. In Europe, using, again, a steel mill waste. In India, using a waste stream from an oil refinery. In South Africa, using waste from ferroalloy production. And in Japan, using municipal solid waste. In each case, our biology converts these waste streams into fuel and chemicals that are used in everyday life. Through the use of engineered biology, we are able to not only produce fuels, but also an array of important commodity chemicals. By converting these waste streams in high volumes into commodity chemicals, we're able not only to add much greater value to the resources we can process, but also achieve carbon capture and sequestration in everyday materials. Imagine a world where carbon can be captured and fixed into everyday plastics, rubbers, and other materials. That is the opportunity offered by engineered biology. In our case, we're very excited by the prospects of this field and have invested heavily in the opportunity to leverage engineered biology technologies in order to not only improve the profitability, but also the efficiency of our process. We're also enormously excited by the recognition given to engineered biology in the Act. Well, one thing we would encourage, however, is that the committee recognizes that not all resources that can be processed by biology come from a biological origin. We represent a process whereby we can take waste streams produced by industry that maybe start their life as coal, but are used in industry to produce, say, steel, then are emitted as a waste that can then be converted by biology into a sustainable fuel or a sustainable chemical. Thereby, we are able to achieve a degree of circular economic growth, not only here in America, but throughout the world, through technologies developed here domestically by biological scientists. With that, I'd like to thank the committee and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Dr. Zoloth.
There I am. The Chairman Stevens, Board Member Bard, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Laurie Zoloth. I'm Professor of Religion and Ethics and Senior Advisor to the Provost in Social Ethics at the University of Chicago. And I want to thank the committee for asking me to testify about the ethical issues that arise in the research and the development of engineering biology, and for inviting a scholar of religion and moral philosophy to your deliberations about science. Now, I'm going to describe the ethical challenges that will surely be a part of this research, but I want to say at the beginning of my testimony that I'm very supportive of this basic science, intrigued by the stunning possibilities it will offer, and very grateful that your committee is seriously considering what I believe is a very strong bill. When researchers, however, talk about genetics, Americans begin to worry about probable ethical problems. The first are the usual questions that any genetic alteration of any sort in the natural world raises. We begin to think of our DNA as fundamental to our identity. It's in our DNA is a common phrase to describe the values we think are part of our beings as Americans. So any changing of this DNA code raises issues of what can be changed, who should decide, and who has control over the power to make such changes. Now, you can point out, as many of view did, that humans have been breeding plants and animals for millennia, and that engineering biology is not in principle different. But still, we like to think of nature as fixed, as perfectly in balance, and even normative or morally good. And we worry about the threat to the sanctity of the natural world in this way, or the essential dignity inherent to intact beings to whom we owe respect. Safety concerns are also important. Are the projects safe when used as intended? How dangerous are they when used in unintended ways? And how likely is that to occur? How likely is mistakes? If harm occurs, is it reversible? And genuine concern is raised around the issue of informed consent when biological engineering projects are intended to affect whole populations or whole geographies. Will the benefits and burdens be distributed equally within the population? And if not, will the benefits accrue disproportionately to those already disadvantaged and burdens to those already disadvantaged? And to the extent that those new technologies create burdens for some, will they be accompanied by offsetting policies, whether economic or social, that will ameliorate those effects? What distinguishes these technologies that affect the genetic structure of beings is how it alters the very biological technologies that affect that affect our relationship to humanity itself and to nature itself. And Americans are committed to the idea of equality, regardless of the situation of one's birth. And while we know that genetic lottery can always be unfair, we don't want it to be fixed. We worry about embedding the choices we make today across generations. And linked to this concern are basic ethical questions of justice in the choice of research goals, in the way the projects test its hypothesis, and finally the distribution of the social goods that emerge from the research. But a new sort of problem emerges when researchers talk about making entirely new de novo creations, or making synthetic chemical versions of DNA, or creating entirely new living entities, in essence using a string of chemicals to make new life. This is in principle different from altering already existing organisms. Here we confront issues of mastery, control, and of course profound and unknowable uncertainty. And here as well, we're going to disagree on issues that can be fairly called ontological and theological. Ought we to tremble when we cross such a threshold of human knowledge? Of course we can. Are we going to worry that we're going too far or too fast? Of course, but we have ways to ameliorate these questions. Ethics asks the question, what is the right act and what makes it so? It's not a question that emerges from science itself. But in the past, ethicists have been asked to think about science projects. When the NIH proposed the mapping of the human genome, it gave 5% of its budget to work on the ethical, legal, and social implications of the Human Genome Project. And the Healthy Human Genome Project showed that scholars of humanities and law are very eager to think about science. What is needed now are incentives for scientists to understand humanities, law, and policy questions. Young scientists will choose the virtues that guide them very early in their careers, and we need to be sure that they see being honest and humble and just is part of what it means to be a good scientist. And this means they must study historical debates about ethics and learn the complexities of competing moral appeals. We also need to educate bioethicists, I might add, before they opine on the ethical questions that such science raises. We need to regulate this research, and we need to figure out how to do that. All such research will have enormous impacts on the human future, and that's why we need the engineering biology we've heard today, for our future has serious challenges, a changing climate, a rising need for energy, and a growing hungry population. And we need new technologies and new social policies to regulate them. We know our world is very closely connected in complex webs with the smallest form of life. In engineering microorganisms, new vectors for disease, all moving at the microscopic level, all of these can be critical to human survival. Now, the national academies have been able to structure some interesting new guidelines, but at stake is how they are enforced. And the regulation and consideration of whether and how engineering biology can proceed ethically can not only be a discussion among academics or science experts, because these big engineering projects are intended in many cases for widespread and self-sustained use. Community consent processes have to be regulated as well. Ideally, mandated citizen stakeholder engagement should be part of every project that's publicly funded. And these engagement sessions should start at the beginning of the projects and should involve a wider reach than has previously been imagined, including members of trade unions, parent-teacher associations, rural communities, and religious and cultural groups. I propose that the other countries have developed public discussions about this phase of their science and more structured leadership about ethics as well. Being a leader in engineering biology is a tremendous responsibility. It will mean leadership in ethical, social, legal, and environmental research, as well as in science research. It'll mean creating a deep and sustained relationship with a larger international research community that already is frankly ahead of us. In my testimony, I've recommended a few things: a new PhD program in ethical decision-making, sources of moral appeals, the history of ethics and science needs to be funded along with programs for the science itself so the next generation of scholars in ethics can be trained. 2, jointly administered PhD and MA cohorts would train scientists in the humanities and social science and humanities scholars in science. 3, funding for environmental impact studies in every project that proposed any public use. 4, public meetings to think carefully about projects that are more successful if we can expand our ideas about democracy and inclusion. Our American capacity for democratic decision-making can be an important part of our scientific leadership plan, but funding for widespread education and inclusion must reach far beyond the academy. And finally, norms and regulations created by such forces as the national academies and must be supported by administrative regulations that you set up with consideration to the creation of a national oversight committee, both in the early stages of research and beyond. The economy, the environment, and the human world in which we live is shaped by biology, our history, our needs, our limitations, even our imagination. At stake is how we as a society will be able to respond to this new challenge. And when we respond, how we can do so with both courage and thoughtful humility. Other countries have already matured efforts both in engineering, biology, and in the public discussion about their use. Your efforts will be central to our American response. Thank you for this bill and for having the wisdom to support and the courage to lead.
Thank you. Thank you to our expert panel and our witnesses who've joined us today. This is one of the privileges of this job, which is to bring forward your voices and your testimony. At this point, we will begin our first round of questions, and the chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes. And in that vein, allow me to say that your expert testimony means a lot to our committee and our work. As somebody who has a master's in philosophy and spent a lot of time in bioethics, it is certainly a delight to have a philosopher in the room helping manage some of the bigger questions and implications as it pertains to biotechnology. Dr. Haig, according to Dr. Carlson's testimony, biotechnology already makes up at least 2% of the total U.S. GDP, and it is expected to surge in the coming years. And we recognize what we need to do with the NAICS codes, by the way. Areas that have greatly benefited in terms of job creation areas, meaning our regions across the United States, tend to be on the coast, San Francisco Bay Area and Boston, and not surprisingly, much of the academic research also tends to be concentrated in these areas, along with engineering, biology student populations that become part of the bioeconomy workforce. However, the needs and opportunities and brain power are significant across our nation. What role, Dr. Haig, can the federal government play in facilitating the growth and expansion of research centers and industry to other areas across our country, including the Midwest?
Well, I think that as I noted in the testimony, that one of the most important roles the federal government can play is to continue to support basic research at multiple levels. I specifically talked about the undergraduate level and the importance of this hands-on research that students can obtain, and the real-world knowledge that can impart, and how that can then be transferred to to not only a thriving workforce, but also one that has the skills necessary to compete in today's global economy. At the same time, I think that increased level support for basic research can also greatly impact graduate students, graduate studies. These are the people that go on and ultimately start their own companies, perform their own research, and lead to the technologies which are the beginning of new economic sectors. So in short, I would say simply continuing to support basic research, and especially understanding the role that the undergraduates as well as the graduate students play.
Thank you. And Dr. Solomon mentioned this as well in his remarks, but I'd love to hear from you, Dr. Haig, on how well suited our training infrastructure is in the United States to prepare the workforce for a sustainable bioeconomy.
I think that our infrastructure is actually pretty good. I think we have the infrastructure that we need. I think we have faculty people who want to teach and who can do what we need to do. What perhaps is lacking sometimes is the funds to support their efforts. And for a relatively modest investment, we can have a huge influence on the students, both undergraduate and the graduate level. We heard about iGEM, which is a really important program and has continued to grow, and I now believe it has teams from over 80 countries. That is just one example of students who want to get into this field and who want to solve real-world problems. So I think we have the infrastructure. We just need to make sure that we continue to support it so that it can live up to its potential.
Thank you. I have one last question, but I also have something I wanted to say, which is as someone who spent their career in manufacturing innovation focused on the skills gap, certainly very inspired by the programs and the work that you all are leading from, an early stage and some of the continuity that we need to see in workforce training. I think if there's, any last question I might have, it'd be just around some deep thinking around any gaps that we might have in educational programming or development, anything we might be missing in terms of workforce training, particularly if there are jobs going unfilled. We're all quite familiar with the demand and the oftentimes the dogfight for technology talent, and it's multidisciplinary, which poses some challenges. So if you have anything else to add on that, we'd love to hear that.
I honestly cannot think of any obvious gaps that we have. I think certainly at the large research institutions that I've been involved in, we're very broad, and importantly, the technologies and the research that we're doing often impacts multiple areas, and you can see that, for instance, in some of the crops that we're working on. They can be important not only as bioenergy crops, but also important for forage crops as well. And so you can see these multi-use research opportunities, and I think we do a pretty good job. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I now recognize Mr. Baird for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And again, I appreciate this. My difficulty is going to be trying not to delve too deep in some of the conversations that we've had, but I'll try to avoid that. Dr. Solomon, you mentioned several potential applications for your research in the gut microbiome of cattle and other livestock. Could you elaborate on that? Because I'd like to, the next step after you discuss the process, and I want to know what kind of challenges you foresee in translating your research into products and solutions.
So just to recap, I work with microbes that we can find in cattle, sheep, and other ruminants and hindgut fermenters. What they do is they break down the ingested plant material and help other microbes digest that in a way that allows them to provide nutrition to the host animal. They also produce a number of compounds that essentially control which microbes are present and what they do, and the specific identities of those microbes and how many of them there are lead to have an impact on how healthy an animal will be. And so my research tries to understand this and try to understand how to control this. Specific challenges that I see is that as we've discussed right now, that the implications of that research, at least from that dimension, are very clearly agricultural. However, the way that our funding system is set up, for example, the different agencies, they tend to prioritize technologies at different levels of readiness. And so fundamental basics science such as this can be difficult to fund in this environment. And so trying to have a more coordinated framework that has an eye towards these more long-term outcomes, I think would be very beneficial.
Thank you. Second question would relate to gene editing and the gene editing technology. This is for you too, Dr. Solomon. I'm sorry about that, but anyway. And it relates to crossbreeding and hybridization techniques that we've used for years in agriculture. So how does that relate to what we're doing with this gene editing technology, in your view?
So what I think gene editing allows us to do is that it allows us to do these things more effectively and more rapidly than we've never been able to do before. I think in the past, biological research has enabled us to do these things in a controlled fashion. However, at the end of the day, you get what you get. With the techniques that we have available to us, we can actually custom print DNA sequences, and we can actually do this with such precision that these advances can happen in a matter of weeks, months, as opposed to years, which is what has happened in the past.
So we're running close on time. So the one last question, if I may, I might have each one of you respond briefly to the idea that the United States and Europe does have some differences in terms of their interpretation of regulations and policies relating to biotechnology. Could you just quickly give us a feel for that, how that might impact some of the products that we could produce from this process, these processes?
Well, just to start, it will have an impact, and certainly some of the companies that we have invested in are seeing a more challenging regulatory environment in Europe than in the United States. And that's, of course, because the precautionary principle is built into the European Union's fundamental structure, and they have to be cautious. They have to move very slowly, and that will impact our ability to sell to them, but also it will slow them down. You know, there are companies leaving Europe simply because they can't get anything done and have no hope of selling what they make there.
Thank you. Dr. Stone?
I mean, I'm not sure I have much else to add beyond what Dr. Carlson said, other than I think in this new and exciting space, I think that we have not agreed on what definitions are. And so, for example, if we take GMO, what would be GMO and safe in the U.S. might not be GMO and safe in Europe, and vice versa. And I think until we harmonize and agree on those definitions, there's always going to be some friction as to what can and cannot be sold.
Dr. Haig?
I think one of the most important things that we can do to help alleviate this problem across the globe is to continue to provide the information that people need to make informed decisions. And I think that's where higher education can be critical. And so I think we need to continue to do it here in this country, and I think it also probably needs to be done, for instance, in Europe as well. I think many of the decisions that are being made are sometimes made by people who are ill-informed about the subject matter at hand. So I think education will be critical across the globe.
While there are clear differences in terms of opinion and legislation regarding genetically modified organisms between Europe and the US, the area that actually impacts us as a company commercializing biotechnologies is, for example, regulations around what constitutes a renewable or low-carbon fuel. For example, in the US, the renewable fuel standard dictates what a biofuel may be produced from. It basically says that it has to be made from a plant material. In Europe, rather than dictating what a fuel should be made from, legislation now seeks to define what the outcome of the production of a fuel should reflect, i.e., a degree of carbon reduction or carbon emission reduction. And so now in the US, the legislation in this field is somewhat somewhat dictatorial in terms of defining what resources can be used, and in that sense, in my view, is somewhat anti-innovation, because it takes away the power of innovators to develop new ideas with new resources to achieve the outcome that I think legislators had in their mind. Whereas in Europe, the legislation is somewhat more technology agnostic, and so is leaving the field more open for innovators to develop new ways to harness available low-cost resources for the production of renewable or low-carbon fuels.
There are two reasons why it's a different climate in Europe. One of them is the precautionary principle, and this that grew out of a German romanticism and German idealism that says don't do anything unless you can prove that it won't make the world worse. And Americans don't like that principle. American philosophers are pragmatists, and we think the way that things are now is also bad, and so making an improvement is just a matter of going forward in either a world with improvement or a world without. So we use a risk-benefit analysis, a very different kind of philosophy. But secondly, Europe is tremendously affected by the Shoah, the Holocaust, where the German scientists who were in the lead, especially in the chemical industry, saw despite their technological prowess, they were ethically bankrupt. And of course, that tragedy means people are very cautious, especially in the EU in general, and in Germany as leaders in particular. Now, the UK, in looking at this, sees the EU environment as so potentially restrictive that the House of Lords had a committee hearing very much like the one you're having here today, that worried about the same question. How can the British scientists move forward when they're very close to a restrictive atmosphere in Europe? And the same conversation happens in the UK as it does in the United States relative to the much more restrictive environment in the EU. And that's played out in terms of the use of GMOs, GMO crops, which has been banned in many cases in the EU and in their trading partners, but not in the United States. So that comes at a very different history. And I think that history is something we can build on.
Thank you. Yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Foster for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. There appear to be two major threads in bioengineered products. One of them is low-valued fuels, which will rely importantly on things like a carbon tax, price on carbon emissions. The second one is unique high-valued products. As an example of this, I think in Dr. Carlson's testimony, you were talking about a modified PMMA with better properties than normal plexiglass that might uniquely be able to be produced through biochemical means. And so my questions there is, I guess, first to Dr. Simpson, assuming you have an optimal price on carbon emissions rather than one targeting specific crops, what is the range of carbon, the price on carbon to which the state-of-the-art in biotechnology would allow you to be commercially viable with a simple carbon price alone? How close are you right now?
So right now we are operating commercially in an environment where there is no price on carbon. So we produce fuel ethanol in China. There is no price on carbon in China, and we're able to operate entirely viably. The plant that we constructed has a 3-year payback period.
Well,
so this allows us, because the inputs we're able to leverage are themselves very low cost, our advantage because they are low cost, they are non-commodity, they're found in a single location, they're not food, and they're essentially industry waste with no other value other than to be burned as power. We're able to produce.
Oh, so they're not, for example, just pure carbon dioxide. They have a significant energy content in carbon monoxide or hydrogen.
Exactly.
Similar. Okay,
exactly.
So that those are not going to be available on as wide a scale as carbon dioxide would be, for example.
Carbon dioxide is certainly available in extraordinarily high volumes, but carbon dioxide can also be leveraged in the context of technologies like electrolysis, which would allow you to produce hydrogen from, for example, sustainable power to leverage carbon dioxide. However, I would say that the resources that can be converted into carbon monoxide and hydrogen are broad and widely available.
Do you have an estimate of what fraction of carbon emissions could be, if you could capture 100% of energetically viable carbon emissions?
Certainly.
What
So
actions-
if we were able to capture, for example, all the emissions from the steel industry, all the emissions from refineries, and convert all available agricultural residues, we estimate that we could produce over 700 billion gallons of fuel annually. To
And
put
what-
that into context, the current global production of fuel ethanol sits at around 26 billion gallons. So this would allow us to displace something like 33 to 35% of global transport fuels using emissions or wastes from industry, society, and agriculture.
And so, I guess, Dr. Carlson, can you say a little bit about the outlook for specialty chemicals that are uniquely provided by biochemical means?
I can. It's spectacular. So one thing that I didn't point out during the first part of my testimony is that roughly $100 billion in biochemicals that are already out there in the market, that's somewhere between 1/7 and maybe a quarter of the total chemical sales in the United States. So already biochemicals are a massive contributor to the chemicals industry, and we just don't know it because we don't measure it. I'd really like to have a better understanding of what that number is, because those are chemicals that are, as best I can tell, just already outcompeting petrochemicals on price and performance. And then as we learn to better engineer materials, whether that's concatenating unique unit chemical operations that enzymes can perform naturally to make new chemicals, or as our companies are doing now, to design enzymes that have never existed before, that create chemical operations that have never existed before, to manufacture compounds in biology that have never existed before, but that have been sought for quite some time, the world is going to start to look very different. So the set of chemicals that we can make right now using synthetic chemistry is actually quite small compared to what we'd like to make, and the universe opens up as we learn to make those using biology.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things that's opening that up is the whole CRISPR-Cas9 revolution. And I guess I'd like a shout out to the tomorrow we're going to have Jennifer Doudna, the inventor or the co-inventor of the CRISPR-Cas9 system, here in Congress for an R&D caucus briefing to staff members. So any staff members interested, it's I think at 10:30 tomorrow, along with the Biophysical Society having that. And if I could just close quickly, the whole issue with human genetic engineering is something that has been, I think we had our best ever attended hearing of the Science Committee when we we had Jennifer here to talk about human genetic engineering. I think it was ironic that the National Academy study, the second one, was the venue at which the Chinese announced that they had genetically engineered a child. So this has gone from sort of fringe speculation to something that exists that we have to deal with. So I guess if I can ask you one question, is there any alternative to very intrusive international regulation to prevent the abuse of things like human genetic engineering or bioweapons?
Genetic engineering for reproductive purposes and bioweapons are two different kind of discussions. But I can just say that there was everybody else on the planet, except for one rogue scientist in China, was abiding by a very carefully constructed moratorium crafted by the national academies of 3 countries. And that moratorium was honored, but not fully understood, and clearly by this man. And it's still, we have yet to see those babies, so it's unclear whether it's how real the story is, but let's just say it is. He was promptly disciplined by, and carefully disciplined by the scientific community of China and the ethical community of China. So it did show that if you violate the moratorium, there will be significant repercussions. And people who gave him advice are also being reviewed very, very carefully. And strong sanctions will be taken, I think, in those cases. And certainly strong academic approbation will be directed to the people who gave him that terrible advice or didn't disclose what he was doing. Is there anything to prevent this? Reproductive uses of CRISPR technology always needs a woman to agree to become pregnant to give birth to a child at tremendous risk. There's no way to do that safely. There's no way to construct a phase 1 clinical trial with safety. And so ethicists have long opposed this until much more safety standards could be demonstrated much more carefully. And that sets a long way off. For biotechnology, for weaponry, is a much more sobering discussion. I know Dr. Carlson has spent a lot of time thinking about that. We want scientists to be good. My job as an ethicist is to train them to know that you ought never do harm with your science, and that every gesture of science is a profound moral gesture as well as an interesting scientific gesture. And it's my hope, my fond, optimistic hope, that if you train someone to be moral and ethical and responsible to his or her colleagues as well, they would never think about using their technologies for nefarious purposes. But these are powerful technologies, and they're self-sustaining, and careful consideration has to be put in place in addition to ethics training for the regulation of those technologies.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I think one of the lessons I take away from computer viruses is that everything bad that can be done has been done with computer malware. And the fact that there's a very small footprint for these laboratories now, and shrinking footprint is a cause for concern. And I urge all of my colleagues to have the classified briefing on the technology. And I am past my time, so all right.
We can do it second.
Okay, so we're having a second round?
Yeah.
Great, wonderful. Yield back.
Yeah, we'll go. Okay, great. The chair now recognizes Mr. Gonzalez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'll get to you, Dr. Carlson. I have a similar line of question. I saw your hand up. Just thank you, everybody, for being here. The topic discussed today is of great importance to Northeast Ohio. I share Madam Chair's sentiment that we need more science and technology development in the Midwest, where I'm proudly from. Research in the polymer sciences has allowed the University of Akron to become a world-renowned institution in this field. From the invention of cheap spectrometers to measure the amount of nutrients responsible for algae growth in local water systems like Lake Erie, to the development of materials to preserve proteins in medicine. These are just two examples of the incredible research and development that the university is conducting, but very important. So when I think of these technologies, I kind of think of three things, or three questions essentially. One, are we leading? Two, how quickly can we commercialize? And then three, how are we on security and maintaining standards across the world? First, Dr. Simpson, before we get into the bioweaponry. Carbon capture. Can you talk briefly about sort of what % of carbon you are able to capture and repurpose, and then how your technology has developed over time? So kind of when I started, it looked like this, and now we are able to do Y, if that makes sense.
So when we started our company in 2005, at that time our technology literally existed in a test tube. And over the intervening years, we've developed not only the biology, but the engineering allowing gas fermentation, and now offer, as a commercial package, a full industrial process allowing the conversion of carbon monoxide hydrogen, and carbon dioxide gas streams into fuels and chemicals. What does this mean physically? It's a facility that literally is like putting a brewery on the back end of, for example, a steel mill, comprising multiple reactors that stand around 100 feet high and are several feet in diameter, in which gases are converted microbially to, in the first instance, fuel ethanol, but subsequently we'll be able to produce chemicals in those same facilities. In terms of percentage of carbon, it really depends on the input gas. The more hydrogen we have in our gas, the more carbon in that gas stream we fix. For example, we are now constructing a facility that converts a waste stream produced by an oil refinery in India. In that process, 50% of the carbon in the product comes from CO2.
Okay.
At a steel mill, there is no hydrogen. Our process simply converts carbon monoxide into fuels and chemicals, and in that case, we convert carbon monoxide.
Got it. And then you mentioned carbon's doesn't have a price in China. And quickly, if we did price carbon, what would that do to your business model?
That would greatly accelerate our business model. I'll say that. But I mean, just to be clear, one cannot raise money on legislation that doesn't exist.
Right.
So as a company, we are out commercializing a process to build commercially viable plants today in the current legislative environment, and we are without reliance on a carbon tax. A carbon tax would be a wonderful thing for this entire industry, but we cannot raise money on that, and we are not commercializing our process on the basis of its existence.
Got it. And then switching to Dr. Carlson, so it looked like you had your hand up on the bioweaponry. I just want to turn you loose. So what were you going to say? Go for it.
Well, I was going to observe that science is a human enterprise full of humans, and humans are going to do everything they have in science that they've done throughout history, and they're going to make bad decisions. They're going to misuse the technology. My read on what happened in China is that the approbation was not uniform. There was some celebration by parts of the government before other parts of the government shouted them down. And I think what I want to observe there is that whatever standards we think we hold ourselves to are not the same standards, not the same decision-making process that other countries have, and they're going to go off on their own because they can.
Yeah, thank you. I tend to agree. When it comes to these sorts of technologies, I share that sentiment. Sure, there were some who later on maybe said, hey, we shouldn't have done this. Frankly, I don't believe that that's something we can trust and put our faith in going forward. So I yield back. Thank you.
It's clear the Science Committee is the best-kept secret in Congress.
True.
And with that, the chair would like to recognize Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stevens and Ranking Member Baird, for hosting this discussion. I think it's so very important. And congratulations to you, Chairwoman Stevens, on assuming this leadership of a subcommittee that bears great relevance to the strength and future of this country. And to the panel, what a great group of individuals who are sharing great intellect. So thank you for joining us today. Bioscience and biotechnology are exciting fields that offer the promise of life-changing applications across many fields. The federal government is uniquely positioned to lead the way in investing in high-impact research and partnering with universities and industry to innovate. These fields are moving toward or forward in exciting ways in my district. For example, the NSF funded a research experience for undergraduates at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, RPI, to most of us, that allowed RPI to engage a diverse cohort of students in bioengineering and biomanufacturing research projects with an intellectual focus on engineering biological systems and biomanufacturing related to biomedical, chemical, and/or biological engineering. This integrated training experience guided undergraduate students recruited from underrepresented groups from non-research intensive schools through a research project, while also helping them understand how they could pursue an engineering career. I'm also proud to have RPI part of the National Institute for Innovation in Manufacturing Biopharmaceuticals, a public-private partnership to advance U.S. leadership in biopharmaceuticals. This partnership, led by the University of Delaware, is advancing U.S. leadership in the biopharmaceutical industry, fostering economic development, improving medical treatments, and ensuring a qualified workforce by collaborating with educational institutions to develop new training programs matched to specific biopharma skill needs. The federal government should continue these critical investments that strengthen our future workforce while also funding important research in these fields. We must not let the U.S. fall behind in our commitment to lead in scientific exploration and technology development, or risk taking a back seat to nations which do make such innovation a top priority. So to any and all on the panel, one synthetic biology breakthrough that got a lot of attention 2 years ago is synthetic spider silk, which researchers at the University of Cambridge created to mimic the strength, stretchiness, and energy-absorbing capacity of real spider silk. The same year, a California-based startup called Bolt Threads debuted its own bioengineered spider silk men's tie. They now sell an entire clothing line. They started, by the way, with SBIR funding from the National Science Foundation. What's the most unexpected or most weird application of engineering biology that any of you has encountered?
Well, there are many of them, actually, and I could, go on for hours. I don't think you want me to do that here.
Yeah,
But
just a sampling, if you could, quickly.
I'd like to just shout out to the Microsoft Digital DNA information storage project that I'm fortunate to work on as a consultant. So rather than storing information on magnetic tapes or CDs or in flash drives, that will soon become impractical given the amount of information that we're generating on a daily basis and need to store, whether it's photographs or government records or your Facebook profile, whatever that may be. And we need something else. And it turns out that biology has provided us with a beautiful and perfect, for this application in storage media, that is DNA. And we can now read and write DNA. And when they asked me to join this project, because I had been around for a while, I know some things about reading and writing DNA and the economics and the pace, that I thought it was a bit of a lark. I thought, sure, it's a nice consulting gig, and I'll learn some things. I got to hang out with some smart students. A couple of years later, it's going incredibly well. It's moving very rapidly, and I'm convinced that we not only will do this, we must do it. We will be changing our entire data storage industry over to look something like biology, because it works. And an entire data center storing a good fraction of the internet can be the size of a sugar cube of DNA. And that is opening my mind to all kinds of new applications, because we can also now compute directly on that DNA using other molecules, which has been a goal, sort of a science fiction story for a long time, but it's now a reality in that group. And I'm having trouble, even just conceiving of the limits of that once we get it going.
Madam Chairwoman, can I just ask that the other four just give us an example, please? I'm out of time, but I would love to hear from them, please.
So an example that I think is really fascinating. As of now, I'm not aware if it's actually been commercialized yet, but there's been some talk about using plants as sentinels in public spaces. And so, for example, we're increasingly faced by a number of threats, both biological and explosive. However, plants have an ability to naturally breathe and respire. And so they can sample, they beautify public spaces, they can sample the air, and they can sample these particles. And in some cases, they can actually tell us if a threat is possible. And so I think it's amazing to imagine that you could walk in an airport, and rather going through the very elaborate TSA screening that you go through right now, you just walk by a tree, it makes the space look beautiful, and if there's something wrong, it will alert you. That's one of the more wacky things that I think I've come across.
I don't know if I would, it's certainly not wacky, but it certainly impresses me a lot. And that is trees, again, keeping on that theme. These are trees where lignin, which is a structural polymer of the tree, has been engineered to break down very easily when under certain conditions. And so it still holds its structure, and the tree is still happy and healthy, except when we put it under certain conditions, then this complex polymer can break down easily into its components, which can then be, not only then does that release the sugars and allow us to make fuels, but also the lignin itself can be used to make various polymers or fuels as well. And this has applications not only in obviously the biofuels, but also in the pulp and paper industry. So.
One area that I've always been fascinated by is the ability of biology to accumulate the things that it requires for life as it goes through environments, and how we can use that to recover and recycle materials. So there are now companies that use the ability of microbes to adhere or absorb specific high-value elements like platinum or gold or others to actually recover the precious metals from electronic waste. So going forward, when one discards a phone, that those printed circuit boards will be ground up, and the precious metals contained therein will be recovered by microbes that have the specific ability to I guess, attract those metals so that we can recover them, recycle them, and reuse them.
So one serious and one amusing one. So the serious one is that the rapidly growing disease is dengue fever. And malaria, for instance, that was we had been able to address malaria and change the death rate from 1 million a year to 500,000 a year has stalled. And the reason these diseases are hard to fight is because we're using 19th century tools, right? So there's nothing, bed nets are failing a little bit, the vaccines were hard to do, but genetically engineering mosquitoes so that the population changes holds enormous potential for very intractable diseases. These are called gene drives. And I'm very interested in them because they have tremendous, interesting ethical issues, but also they could really transform how these intractable diseases can be addressed. And why this is important for Americans is because the climate's changing. And a city like Los Angeles, my hometown Los Angeles, or all of Florida, has a lot of mosquitoes and has Anopheles mosquitoes, which do carry malaria, right? So malaria used to be one of the leading causes of death in this country, and we managed to eliminate it with 19th century tools, 18th century tools. Now we're going to need 21st century tools, and these genetically engineered mosquitoes represent that kind of impulse. And the funny one is, you know how bread mold makes a gray, furry sort of mat on your, but if you could transform the yeast, as the French have done, and put in a little genetic cassette that makes the fibers cotton instead of furry gray stuff, you can make sheets of cotton. Cotton's a very difficult crop to grow. It's a big plant, small little tufts, and it uses 50% of all the water used in agriculture. But if you could make cotton in sheets by yeast instead of in plants, you could save enormous amounts of water. It'd be better for the environment, and they make very pretty clothes, I must say.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I guess what appears silly or far-fetched at times can bear great relevance. With that, I yield back.
Absolutely. Thank you. The chair would now like to recognize Mr. Marshall for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. You know, as a biochemistry major from the Big 12 basketball champion, Kansas State University, this biotechnology is always quite intriguing to me. And perhaps nothing has been more impacted than the ethanol and biofuels industry. So certainly it's something I've kept a close eye on. I'm amazed what we can do today. We can grow a bushel of corn with 40% less land and 50% less water than we used to. And I'm impressed the impact that ethanol has made on the United States. We've decreased greenhouse emissions by about 43%. We have the potential to decrease it by 76%. Cellulosic fuel has the potential to decrease greenhouse gas emissions by 100%. I've been told that it's the equivalent of removing 124 million cars from the road. So I'm pretty proud of what the ethanol and the biofuels industry have done. But despite this, there seems to be barriers for ethanol coming to the market. And I'm just wondering if anybody on the panel can speak to that. Dr. Solomon, do you have any comments on why we have access problems for the biofuels?
So I can only speak to the technical challenges. I think one of the barriers for cellulosic biofuels is just the cost of breaking down raw plant material into sugars that we can then ferment into ethanol. And I think as the price of oil has dropped, that has become even less competitive than it is. Has been in the past, which is why you're seeing a slowdown in uptake. And that is part of what my research tries to address. I mean, the same microbes that provide nutrition to animals, they are also the same type of organisms that actually break down these materials, and they provide the enzymes to do so. And so for my part, what we're looking at is trying to understand how these unique microbes that we have, how they do it better than the current existing technologies do. And we're developing approaches to actually manipulate them. So rather than complex bioprocessing where we have a cost associated with breaking down lignocellulose and then a cost with upgrading it, can we get some efficiency by combining those two steps in a single organism? Can we engineer this one organism to go directly from grass to fuel rather than having to essentially take out the middleman?
Okay. Dr. Carlson, any thoughts on some of the barriers to market?
Well, I think there are several. One is ethanol is a complicated molecule to dump into an engine. And so even though lots of engines today are supposedly flex fuel and can handle ethanol, it's the wrong kind of solvent, is the right way to say that, I guess. And if you look at Brazil's experience, you know, there are people who like to drive 100% ethanol cars and people who like to drive 100% gas cars, but it's hard to mix those two very effectively on a day-to-day basis. So that's nothing to do with ethanol manufacture. It is everything to do with the way cars work. So that's one thought. And then another, again, back to the oil price, is that there are certainly months now, if you look at the month-to-month fluctuations in the cost of corn and the cost of ethanol, the price of oil, where it costs more to buy the corn to make ethanol than you can sell the ethanol for, which is a problem that you can't solve by making better ethanol from corn just because corn costs so much. But I would observe that what I hope happens in the future is we shift from making ethanol to higher value compounds. So we use something like 30% of our corn crop in the United States for industrial use, one way or another. A lot of that's ethanol, which sells for give or take $1 a gallon, or $1 a liter maybe, somewhere in that range. Wouldn't it be nice if we had technology that could upgrade that to something that's sold for $10 a liter or $100 a liter? So that's getting more toward that $100 billion in biochemicals. Those are higher end chemicals rather than competing at the low end of the barrel as ethanol does with fuel. So my recommendation would be, as part of the bill, to really think about how to facilitate the use of crops that right now are commodities. We're great at growing those in the States, as you say. But rather than aim the product at something that's a commodity, low end of the barrel, aim it at something that's much more useful for higher value products.
Okay. Got 20 seconds left. I guess I'll yield back 3 minutes of my time. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now going to move into a second round of questions. So the chair is going to recognize herself again. And the question is for Dr. Carlson and Dr. Simpson. To sustain job creation and U.S. leadership in the bioeconomy and our innovative biotechnologies, we must look to protect against forced technology transfer, industrial espionage, and theft. And as Dr. Carlson and others have noted, a number of other nations have launched sustained and effective efforts to build their own bioeconomies and biotechnology transfer activities. In the meantime, tensions have flared between the U.S. and China in particular regarding trade policies and intellectual property protections. The U.S. has benefited historically from scientific collaboration, even with some of our adversaries, and there remains legitimate concerns that an overly protectionist approach might also hinder innovation. So what should the U.S. government look to do to strike the right balance between protecting the fruits of our innovation while also supporting the growth of industry?
Well, I'd like to answer that question in 2 ways. The first is to look back to a report on how the internet developed and how the funding for the internet developed called Funding a Revolution. That was a National Research Council study many years ago. And it broke down where the money came from to build products that wound up in the world. And there were roughly 3 buckets worth of funding. One is research, one is development, and then we'll call the other one productizing. And research, fundamental research, is about 1% of the contribution of the final cost or the final total investment. The development showing that it can become a product is about 10%. The other 90% is the hard work of basically putting it in a box and turning it into something that somebody wants to buy and use. I'm a great fan of looking back in history to understand the future of biotechnology, and that 1-10-90 rule seems to hold true for many of the industries that have developed in the U.S. And the U.S. government provided not just a large chunk of that 10% in development, it provides almost all of the 1%. So that also is largely true for biotechnology. So the U.S. government taxpayers are funding a huge amount of the basic research that eventually results in products, even if companies are funding a lot of the development down the road. And so I think we should pay a lot more attention to what happens to the products of those research when they become startups, when they become big companies. In effect, if you look at the way China, for example, has dealt with its own research agenda, it doesn't spend that much on basic research. Instead, it appears to be farming that task out to the United States. So there's a great deal of acquisition, or had been. Thankfully, this is now coming to a sudden halt. A great deal of acquisition by Chinese companies, many of which appear to have close relationships with the Chinese government, to acquire U.S. taxpayer-funded technology and deliver it to the biotech industry in China. And so the CFIUS trial period, I mean, I don't know exactly how to talk about that at the moment, but those new regulations are having an impact. We are seeing that even in our own companies. They're having some more trouble finding capital that was evidently flowing freely from China. And even though that is impacting me personally and impacting them personally, I'm totally fine with that. It should be harder for foreign companies to come in, foreign governments to come in and acquire that technology.
Dr. Simpson, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, so I mean, think for commercial companies, inherently protecting intellectual property developed domestically is part of our lifeblood. So internally, we invest an enormous amount of effort and energy into not only solidifying our patent portfolio, but protecting technology as trade secrets, ensuring that all information that we develop is harnessed behind firewalls, et cetera, et cetera. So data protection, invention protection, intellectual property protection is an inherent part of our business. But we're also seeking to commercialize technologies internationally. And I think it is appropriate that technologies advanced here domestically, that domestic companies have the opportunity to commercialize that throughout the world and therefore generate revenues that flow back to the United States. And not hindering that commercialization is something that I think that the panel should consider very strongly, because in order to maintain leadership, the opportunity for local innovations to commercialize elsewhere is something that should be encouraged, because that encourages further investment in this technological area.
Great, thank you. And the chair would now like to recognize Mr. Foster for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to bring up the interesting subject of artificial meat, which is another interesting horse race that's happening. I remember after I had been defeated in the Tea Party wave about a decade ago, I was trying to figure out what to do with my life next, and was fascinated by a set of papers coming out of, I think, the Netherlands on cell-based artificial meat, which seemed like the promising avenue at that time. But I was struck last weekend. I stopped at a White Castle and treated myself to a Impossible Slider, which is a 100% plant-based artificial hamburger, and to my mind, or my taste buds, a quite credible substitute. And so I was wondering, there's also a recent article, I think in Science Magazine, questioning the carbon footprint of cell-based meat. That it might actually not be a big win compared to just harvesting a crop and stuffing it through an animal and eating the animal. That in that case, the plant-based approach might be much better from a carbon footprint point of view. I was wondering if any of you have comments on how you view that horse race.
I mean, I think the first thing to say is I think it is a fascinating development, because for many of the people who would inherently be interested in consuming, for example, an Impossible Burger, they may also be interested in organic food. They may also be interested in non-genetically engineered food. And the Impossible Burger represents a highly inorganic, highly genetically engineered meat substitute. So from this perspective, and as a scientist, it represents an incredible way of educating the public as to what is possible, but what one needs to think about when consuming the possible or impossible.
I just want to say one thing about the Impossible Burger is that it was developed by an HMI scientist, one of America's leading scientists from Stanford University, who gave up tenure and HMI funding because he was devoted to trying to solve climate change in any way he could, as Patrick Brown. And this development he's committed to doing this, making sure it's not just a hippie alternative, but it's in White Castle, and it's widely available. And that's a transformative technology. Of course, America leading the way in this use of the most innovative and interesting science to deconstruct the hamburger is really it really shows the power of this kind of technology and the way that it should be supported. And it's very good, too. It's tasty.
I do have one observation here, which is that it's very early. So whatever the assertions are today about the economics, about the environmental cost of production, they are they will change. And the window that I have into this is not via meat necessarily, but it's human cell culture for therapies. So one of our companies is manufacturing stem cells for therapies. And they have driven the cost down by orders of magnitude just in the last few years. There's another couple of orders of magnitude to go. And they're reducing the footprint of the materials they use, the environmental footprint of the materials they use, as well as the cost. So I have a strong suspicion that whatever the analysis suggests today about the environmental and economic cost of meatless meat it's going to change so much that it's going to be fine in effect.
Any other comments? All right, and another sort of big picture question. Do we have enough farmland? If all your dreams come true, are we going to have, for the number of people, just assume that we keep the population constant in the United States and look at the rate at which we consume transportation fuels, all the other things. When you get all the efficiencies working here, are we going to find ourselves having surplus farmland and turn large fractions of the country back into national parks? Or what's your view of how this will all end up, 100 years from now?
Over the long term, yes, we could return substantial fractions, I think, of the land now under cultivation to other use, to natural, there's this old phrase, the gardenification of nature. It turns out that significant fractions of this country were not so natural even when European settlers arrived. They were altered significantly by the native population. So back to that observation that we use about 30% of our corn crop for industrial use already. In that sense, we produce more than enough food in this country to use those raw materials for other purposes. And I think it's also important to recognize there are other technical trends coming that impact that. So I keep a close eye on electric cars and solar and wind, and basically how the electricity grid is changing. And well before 100 years from now, we're going to have shifted transportation use to nearly 100% electric vehicles. And that means that, if you plan on selling ethanol as a fuel, that market isn't actually going to be around very much longer. It'd be surprising to me if that were a 10-year market even. Mm-hmm. So we're going to wind up using those crops to make chemicals much sooner than maybe everyone is anticipating. Exxon, for example, is investing now very heavily in petrochemicals. I'm not sure that's a wise choice of their investment.
I think one thing I would mention is that whilst it's true that electric vehicles will affect the market for ethanol, there are fuel markets that in which we cannot electrify. And so we cannot I, for one, am not getting on an electrically powered plane anytime in the next 50 years. That is almost certainly not going to happen anytime soon. And so one has to develop low-carbon fuel solutions for sectors where battery technologies simply won't provide the solutions required. And I think that, within our company, we've developed a technology to convert ethanol actually into jet fuel, ethanol into diesel. And so using a molecule that we can produce en masse from agriculture and from waste streams, and ultimately from CO2, as a platform for the production of high-density air transport, sea transport, and road transport fuels, as well as a platform for a variety of commodity chemicals, makes absolute sense from both an industrial security, energy security, and national security perspective.
I just want to throw my 2 cents in there, too. I didn't mean to say that we won't have any liquid fuels or that there won't be any use for that kind of technology. But I think the world is going to change remarkably over the next 10 years. And if you look at China, just in the last 6 months, internal combustion automobile sales have been crashing, and electric vehicle sales have been going through the roof. And it's going to really alter the way we, very soon, I think about how we use our petroleum resources and our biological resources.
Thank you. And I guess I made the mistake a couple years back of going to one of these websites where you calculate your personal carbon footprint, and found as a member of Congress it was completely dominated by the fact that I fly back to Illinois each weekend to say hello to those who elected me. Anyway, I want to thank the panel. This has been really good, and the chair for having this hearing.
Well, Before we bring the hearing to a close, we obviously want to thank our witnesses, our expert witnesses, for testifying before the committee here today. We find ourselves in the Research and Technology Subcommittee at a tipping point where there is no vision, the people will perish, and where we find ourselves dipping into the future. And so the remarks of my colleague, Mr. Tonko, about the importance and honor of being a part of this committee are quite significant. And we remain very pleased to have such strong Midwestern leadership at the table and with us here today, particularly given the important role that industry, government, academia, philosophy plays in having these dialogues, and as we look to put forward the Engineering, Biology, Research, and Development Act. No doubt today was significant. So our record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from members and for any additional questions that the committee may ask. The witnesses are excused and the hearing is now adjourned.